Good morning, everyone. For those in the US, and good afternoon to everyone in the UK. Welcome to this week's HeartBTK Technical Conference. Today we'll have one presentation, and we're scheduled to end at the latest 9 a.m. Pacific Time. This presentation will be recorded and accessible online once we've processed it. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type it in the message box. And also please mute your mic during the presentation to prevent any background noises. Today, Dr. Ben Good from Scripps will be presenting about a project called Science Game Lab. Without further ado, allow me to introduce Ben.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, thanks, Vincent. Okay, so when we first wrote up the grant that's paying for this and many other things, we wrote in something called Big Data World, which is what I'm going to be describing today, and that Big Data World has become Science Game Lab. I picked up this article a couple days ago that had that title in it. I thought it was kind of surprising and timely that Big Data World exists in that article and now exists on the web. So, Science Game Lab. Let's see if I can forward. Now I've got Okay, so today I'm going to kind of give you an idea of what Big Data World is, what Science Game Lab is, and why it exists, to start off with. Give you an idea of kind of where we are with its development. Introduce to you a partnership that has emerged over the last few months with the Wiki Pathways groups through this project, and then we'll talk a little bit about next steps. We'll look forward to any ideas from the audience about future directions that you might see. And in fact, I should say, I don't know if anyone from the educational portion of the B2K grant is on the call, but if they're not, maybe we could direct their attention to this, because I'd really like to solicit some attention from people that are really involved in the training portion of this work, because I think this is quite relevant to them. So, okay, so I can't give a presentation without providing this picture of the growth of knowledge at one point in time. So we know that as a metric of the kind of growth of biomedical knowledge in the world, we're at more than 1 million a year, million journal articles a year, and growing. And the task that I have been chewing on for the better part of 10 years now is to figure out ways to render the knowledge in those articles somehow computable, so they can be accessible for better science, better bioinformatics analysis. There are, of course, many other problems, some more difficult, all very different, that we are in our community are faced with: designing new RNA molecules to specific structures and functions, folding proteins appropriately, doing large multiple sequence alignments, mapping the connectivity of neurons in the brain, and not least, improving the state of science education in the world, and particularly here in our country. Something that you'll note, that all of these problems are currently worked on by people, and as people have noticed, all of them can benefit from what some people refer to as human computation. So basically, if you get people thinking hard about these problems, we can make progress. And the way human computation in particular works is the idea is that you get many, many people working on the problem together, and then you can do things that computers can't. And I would lump in science education into that mix, although generally speaking, when people talk about human computation, they're just talking about problem solving. So that's great in theory. How do you do it? And of course, the answer is to turn these problems into games. Why games? People like playing games. They're a great way to get people to do work. So it's been estimated that people spend more than 150 billion hours per year playing games. And that was a 2011 estimate that I'm quoting here. In contrast, consider that it took only 7 million hours to build the Empire State Building. And if you just look at solitaire, the estimates are around 9 billion human hours. So obviously these are a good way to motivate people, and obviously we have an enormous amount of sort of brain capital out there in the world that could be tapped. Now, A number of different groups, including ours, have recognized this and have been starting to develop these kinds of games for solving problems such as the ones that I listed above. Everyone's, I'm sure, heard of the Fold-It protein folding game. One of our partners in this effort has been the Philo game, which is for multiple sequence alignments. We also have RNA structure prediction and a whole variety of other things emerging. So, apart from doing science with games, everything you see here is intended to collect data, basically to collect cognitive cycles of one form or another, and use them for a purpose. The flip side of this is learning science with games. And so, in fact, if you go back to that list, many of these things are now actually commonly used as introductory material for learning and attracting students to learning about science, even though that wasn't their original purpose. People love games, especially in education. I mean, Fold-It, for example, is just ubiquitous in 3D protein structure and prediction classes now. But of course, I would say even more games are built only with the specific goal of education. If any of you have children, you'll know that schools will be pushing educational software framed as games down as much as they can because they think it's a good idea. And in many cases, it is. I'm not going to go into sort of the depth about education with games right now. I do have an older presentation you can go to at that link there, tinyworld.com, ISMB games, that will go into much more depth about that. But I will say that there's clear evidence that games can be used to teach science. In fact, one of our collaborators on Science Game Lab authored this paper a few years ago which is a study of a game that she created called Immune Defense or Immune Attack. And it basically just scientifically proves that kids that play this first-person shooter game running around the immune system actually soak up quite a bit of understanding of the concepts of immunology through it and because of it. So it's a worthwhile method to use. So that's fantastic. Why do we need Science Game Lab? This is one way of saying why. So if you look at the spectrum of games and problems that can be solved and the depth of learning that can be achieved, sort of on the y-axis here, and you look at the fact that it's supposed to be a game and it's supposed to be fun, we can plot out things. So you could say if you're talking about education, you can think of a classroom setting, or if you're talking about solving a problem, you think of a work setting. Generally speaking, they're not gamified. It's not super fun. Per se. And you can see examples of these things where it's largely just where we're starting to move a little bit away from that by adding elements of games into the systems, add badges and leaderboards, etc. And as you move in the direction of fun, you generally speaking get a better player experience, but the ability to communicate complex concepts can tend to drift down because the focus shifts more towards making it fun and less towards solving the hard problem or teaching you the hard concept. And of course, what we want to achieve in this community is figure out ways to make it so much fun to solve super hard problems and to understand super hard concepts. The trouble is that as you move along both of these axes, the cost goes up and up and up. And so it's not easy to make a fun, engaging game. It takes a lot of money and effort, nor is it easy to solve these hard problems, of course. And so, I mean, games, although in principle have this amazing capacity, they're not cheap things. And that's a misconception, I think, among the scientific community, that it's easy. And what are the reasons for this? There's basically no tradition of open source code in the game industry. So coming from a bioinformatics perspective, that was sort of surprising. No matter what, you're basically starting from scratch when you're trying to build one of these things. And because, from hard personal experience, trying to make progress in this world, it's hard because we don't have the experience necessary within our community to just start building them ourselves very effectively. Our postdocs coming to our lab that get interested in this generally don't know anything about graphic design, web design, mobile application development, how to make a good game, what it means for something to be fun, etc. And that makes it expensive and hard to produce good products. And at the end of the day, without truly great games, it's very hard to gather and keep that attention, tap into that 150 billion hours for very long. And so that brings us to Science Game Lab. And the purpose of Science Game Lab is to provide a mechanism for pooling limited resources, okay, and for two groups of people. First of all, developers of games in this genre. What we want to do is lower the barrier to entry so that anyone that has an idea for using game mechanics or building a game outright has an easier time getting started by reducing the amount of code needed to solve their problem and making it easier to attract players and students. These are two things they need to do. And then on the player/student side, we want to make it easier to find games that are relevant. We don't want to be able to track from one game to the next as we learn different concepts in a kind of unified experience. And we also want to tap into this kind of ability to establish a unified identity as a participant in the process of science, is what people are calling citizen scientists. People really resonate with this. I think it's a force that we can use to get people's attention, keep it, provide them with something that they can go on with that is of value to them beyond what they learn within the games that we provide. So what is Science Game Lab? It's a centralized online location, so it's a website, for scientists and the general population to come together for the purposes of advancing citizen science and learning science. It's a collection of open source tools. Everything that's written for it is open source and MIT licensed. There's developer APIs for using it. It provides people with the ability to do common tasks like provide badges, establish leaderboards, find other users that do similar things. And so, one misconception about what it is, it's not just a portal for finding games. So there are other really nice examples of that, also provided by a collaborator, Melanie Stegman, who I mentioned earlier with the Immune Attack game. She has something called Science Game Center, whose purpose is to just basically be an index. So you can go into it, search for science-related games, and find one, and then go off and play it. What I'm going to show you here has that capability eventually, but it really is trying to do quite a bit more. Basically, the idea is that we can pool together experiences that span all these games in a kind of unified, consistent framework, and we can provide people with tools for building them from scratch. So Science Game Lab is a collaboration now between our lab here at Scripps, a company called PlayMaddox, who I was lucky enough to meet at an NIH meeting about a year or two ago. And PlayMaddox has really done basically all of the work that I'll be presenting today. And recently, as I mentioned, we'll talk about Wiki Pathways and their relationship to this. Briefly, PlayMaddox is an actual game design and experience company with real clients apart from outside of science. They're really a member of the actual industry, working with people like HBO and Red Bull and so forth to make really effective experiences on a number of different levels. So it's basically games and games for health and many other different kinds of projects. And it's really a privilege, I think, for us to have the opportunity to work with them on this project. And so, the idea here, and one of the reasons that I think PlayMaddox was interested in joining us, is that there's this real latent need, I think, within the larger community to be able to take part in science and participate in things that are meaningful. So people want to play games because it's fun, but they also want to have a connection to the scientific process. On the way to work today, I drove by a breast cancer walk/run setting up that will have thousands of people there, showing their support for the cause of advancing that science. And so what we're doing here is giving people another outlet for that need to connect and be part of and support the scientific effort. So let's have a look at what is in there right now at sciencegamelab.org. So now, if you're brave and you can tolerate when things may or may not work, you can go to sciencegamelab.org/beta.php, sign up for an account, and you can actually play with what I'm going to show you right now. It's all very recent. Lots of it works. Some of it may not work, depending on what happened with the developers over the night last night. But it's all coming together. Everything I'm showing you here is something I got off the live site. So this is the screen that you'll see when you log in or you click on the home button. Notice it has a number of different components to it. And so if you kind of scroll down, you'll go move to the left, and you would see, as more games come online, a kind of cover flow-like visualization of games coming into it. At the moment, there's only one, so it doesn't do a whole lot. Next, I want to draw your attention to this panel, which will provide, and already does provide, a high score list, and we'll see other things like that, that spans the entire site. So this is a collection of different games, but the portal itself is its own sort of metagame, and we'll be using that as a way to kind of move people from game to game, getting them to do more and have more learning experiences within the site. And this is one of the distinguishing features between what you see here and, as I mentioned, just a general web index or portal for finding things. So we're actually providing a kind of unified experience across all the different members of the site. Over there on the left, the navigation panel, that one will get you to games, just a simple list of the games. This will get you to the achievements that are possible, the badges that you can acquire, the quests that you can complete. That will get you to help. And down there on the bottom, and also here, is a link to your profile. The profile is really, I think, the kind of center of this site, and so it's probably best when you use it to go out from there. That'll make the most sense, generally speaking, right now. And so having a look at my profile here at the time that I took this. Right now, this is showing me I can edit my profile, change my, my name, and do the normal profile things. What it's showing is the badges that are accessible within the system, all of them. Currently, there are 24, most of them coming from the Wiki Pathways game. I see I've unlocked one of them, which is I edited my profile. From here, you would also be able to see the quests that could be completed. If you click on these badges, they'll give you a direct link into how you might gather them through a game in the system. And there's a function for finding other users within the system to have a look at their profile. So if you go back to the home, or you click on the games, you can get to, here's the listing of games. Our first demo game here is the Wiki Pathways Academy game. I'm going to try and get into a little more detail about that and why it's there later, but first I'll just kind of give you a run through. So if you find it on the live game section, you click on it, you'll get to its game page. Now, just to be clear, this is not something that it's a product of us per se, although we've been helping them build it. The idea here is that anyone could come in with their game and add it to the site, and the site will just be incorporated into it. And so this is a host for other people's work, not necessarily we're going to build all the games that you see. So again, this is the game page. You get an opportunity to put an image on it, describe what you're doing. It shows a leaderboard of the players of that particular game, a little screenshot. And most importantly, it has this button over at the top, which is the Play Now button. If you click it, then you'll launch into the first game experience there. And currently, this is what happens, okay? So we clicked on that button, and this is the screen that we see. It's composed of two pieces. First, in the blue box, excuse me one second. First, in the blue box, you'll see the game content. In this case, it's just a quiz. That content is coming from the Wiki Pathways team, from their website. This is shown in the context of an iframe, which is provided by Science Game Lab, which also renders the box on the bottom, which they refer to in GameSpeak as a heads-up display. That box will provide you feedback and navigational possibilities based on your actions that you take at your partner's site. So moving forward, I click on the button in the middle, I get the answer right, the site itself gives me feedback, that information is sent to the Science Game Lab API, which records the actions, associates them with my user account. So I can get increase my score, accumulate badges, and so forth. And that action also comes back and is rendered on that heads-up display on the bottom. So I get a little alert, my activity feed increments, and perhaps my badges or levels go up. And so that so this is an example of how the developers of this little form don't have to touch the work of showing and visualizing these badges, basically of doing the kind of gamification, providing some of the gamification elements to their experience. They do have to hook up to the API, and so there is some amount of work, but some of it is also taken care of just directly by that system. So apart from the activity feed that I was showing you there, there's also the other tab on the bottom there that will show you related activities, so you can leap from this particular challenge off to other ones that they provide. So for example, I click on the first one there, first cholesterol catalysis, which is a challenge about learning how to read a pathway from Wiki Pathways. Once again, it's got a kind of quiz structure. I look at the pathway, I get it right, and then I see that I completed a new action there, and that's recorded by the system. I would say just that this is not limited to things that happen entirely over there. So in the Wiki Pathways system, they actually have this editor called PathVisio. One of the tasks that they have in there is to actually get out of the system, create a pathway diagram in PathVisio, and then add it back into their site over here. That's in the Science Game Lab context. And if you correctly create the pathway, you can tell, and will give you your reward, your badge. Once you say you're done, you want to go back to the site or leave it somehow. It gives you an idea of your progress, any increments and levels that may have happened, any increments to your points or badges, and so forth. And then you can come back into the site and do other things. So I mentioned that one of the sort of big portions of work lately has been the introduction of the concept of quests. So within the games or sort of learning experiences, they're divided, generally speaking, they're divided up into units of work or units of learning, and these can be assembled into these groups called quests. And you can see when I go to my quest view, you can see how far I am along each of these different things. Once I complete them, I'll get a badge to add to my profile, and that will make me happy, generally speaking. So just to reiterate how this works, the game developer builds a game or simply a series of tasks that they want the player/student to perform. So that's on them. Then they come to SGL, Science Game Lab. They sign up as a developer, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And they use our tools provided through the website to bind events in the game to triggers that send information to Science Game Lab. Ultimately, technically, this happens in little bits of JavaScript that get put into the context of their existing web game / application that send that information off to Science Game Lab. Science Game Lab server then has its responsibility of tracking the user's behavior across the different games and providing those in-game and site-wide reward mechanisms that I was showing. So the developer's process is to create an account on Science Game Lab. So if any of you want to experiment with this, that would be the first step, is to basically sign up for an account and then request developer access. You should be able to do this by clicking on a link in your profile. That wasn't working yesterday. Maybe it's working now. Certainly you can email us and we'll add you to, we'll upgrade your account to developer status. You got to have your game ready to get started. And then you go to the developer portal and configure your game events. So decide which task you're going to connect with, excuse me, You're going to decide which tasks you connect with which amount of points, which badges, which set of quests, and so forth. And all that is done inside of the portal. For much more detailed information, you can see the kind of emerging documentation down there at this tiny URL, SGL dev. So this is just a peek at the development portal aspect of the site. You see this is your developer portal. Once you log in, you'll see this. You see this is the Wiki Pathways Academy game. You click the other button to add a new game. And then you have a series of screens, basically wizard-like screens that will walk you through the process of hooking your game up and plugging it into the system. So adding, for example, the different actions and so forth that you want to enable in the system. So, okay, so that's where we are right now with the system. If you get in there in the beta site, you should be able to play a smattering of the tasks that are coming together for the Wiki Pathways group. They are going to be finishing what they are calling Wiki Pathways Academy, hopefully by sometime in December, hopefully soon. So that will be at least a complete experience there. Mostly what's missing is the content from them at this point. But truth be told, they are the only one that's actually live in the system right now. In the pipeline, we have a number of different games that are under our lab's control, which we will be moving into the system. Note that not all of them are games per se, and just like the Wiki Pathways thing isn't exactly a game. That's okay. You can still use the system to basically reward or sort of gamify an existing series of tasks you want people to do. It also will work with true games like Philo. The developers of Philo were one of the people that first were inspired to do this kind of work and have been helping along the way the whole time. And it's one of the games that we hope to see in there sooner rather than later. And so all of these things are kind of the low-hanging fruit for what will be in there. But from there, the system is built to scale up and intended to scale up. And so what I hope to see is that, in the next month or two, we complete the kind of technical work and we have the framework in place, and then we spend much of the following year filling it in with content and tuning the system to make sure that it's a really positive experience. Once we have all of these member games, then we can start really composing ideas that span from one game to the next. And so you can imagine composing quests that involve editing a pathway at Wiki Pathways and then going into Philo and completing a multiple alignment involving the genes in that pathway, and then going into Mark to Cure and annotating documents related to that gene. Basically creating a very rich framework for learning about these kinds of scientific tasks and completing them. And hopefully through that combination, we can accumulate a large community of both developers contributing content to this and a very large community of consumers that get in there and enjoy learning about and contributing to the process of science through this mechanism. That's the intention. So now, as I finish up here, we will have plenty of time for questions, I think. I think I want to spend a little bit of time on Wiki Pathways specifically and just kind of explain to you why they were so interested in joining us for this and why we're so interested in having them as part of this. And that's in particular because I think many of the people involved in the Heartbeat 2K grant probably know Wiki Pathways and are actually interested in building very similar things or even using it directly. So it's in some ways maybe the most relevant to many of you. And so this is from Alex Pico, one of the creators of Wiki Pathways. Why is it there? And just to take a little quote from him, it addresses our greatest challenge of convincing people they are qualified and skilled enough to contribute to the knowledge base. And we also want to make it fun. So this is the problem that they're faced with. So this is what Wiki Pathways is for. So out there in the world, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, we have knowledge that's generally speaking represented in the published literature, in people's lab notes in their own heads, and in images that are as part of those publications. Wiki Pathways is a pathway editing wiki, an open system where people can turn that unstructured knowledge into structured, computationally accessible pathway diagrams and actually computable structures. Once we have those structures, you can, you have authorship over them, you can produce your images from them, you can use them for doing visualization and analysis of data. This is probably the most important end product here for the scientific community. And so the challenge they face is how to get that work done. It's not a trivial process to do this conversion. Even if it has the word wiki on it, it doesn't mean it's easy. And just to give you an idea again of the scope of the problem and their progress so far, that the open system of Wiki Pathways. So on the top here, on the y-axis, we have the number of human genes represented in a pathway, and then the y-axis, the x-axis, the year. These are two systems. One is KEGG, which is done basically in the kind of traditional model of doing work, where you pay people and they do the work. Wiki Pathways is done in the wiki model, where some people are paid, some people do it for free for many different reasons. And you can see it is growing at a nice rate already. It's one of the more successful examples of this kind of open knowledge acquisition system. But the truth of the matter is that it's got a long way to go. It hasn't even touched pathways for half of the genes, half of human genes. And of course, just having one gene and one pathway doesn't mean that you know everything about what it does. Far from it. And so they have and recognize they have an enormous amount of work ahead of them. To put that in perspective from them, so we have this many pathway figures published every 3 to 4 months. So in the diagram, you're seeing actual images pulled from a PubMed central search for signaling pathway. So what you're seeing is almost 2,000 different pathway figures. And that's randomly selected from almost 30,000 results from just the last 5 years. And so these are static images, so completely inaccessible to computation. But just to give you an idea of the scale of work that we're faced with in turning in the sort of knowledge translation problem. So when they come to Science Game Lab, they have two basic ideas of how they're going to use it. First of all, they're using it as a framework for recruiting and training new users. This is why what you saw in there were what is called Wiki Pathways Academy. This is what they're going to be using to teach people how to do the work. And so they're going to use it and are using it to transform the user manuals and videos into an interactive content experience that can plug into through Science Game Lab. This gives them ways to not only make it more fun, but also leverage other things like competition and achievement, all of the elements of games that people enjoy. That being said, there's also the idea that they can use Science Game Lab as a crowdsourcing system for accomplishing streams of curation tasks that are related to pathway construction. So while it may never get to the point where people will go in there and completely create a pathway for Wiki Pathways through the system, we can certainly come up with ways that we can provide people with the opportunity to do things that help improve the content in the system in a kind of micro-task fashion. So for example, adding ontology terms to text nodes and existing pathways. So, and also and this is really for people that might consider doing something like this within our system. So what they did in collaboration with us is they translated their training materials into this path of different, very unitary steps. So, we saw in the example earlier a question about the central dogma of biology, the sort of DNA, RNA, protein. And so we have these basic sets of tasks that are organized by color here, and they'll be turned into quests. So basically the concept here is that a new user, and they're aiming to make this possible for someone coming in from, as a sophomore in high school, for example, could walk all the way through this path of learning, each of these being elements of like game elements accessible within Science Game Lab and organized into these learning quests all the way through, and I haven't even shown half of their sort of learning snake, yet until they get out the end of it and they understand enough about biological pathways as a concept and about Wiki Pathways as an editing system that they can make legitimate contributions to Wiki Pathways. And so they did have to go through this sort of rethinking of the process of how they teach people how to do this, and this sort of reformulation into these sort of micro units that could then be assembled with the Science Game Lab system. And so with that, looking forward, what they really want to do is get to the point where they can build a system that ingests these images, because pathways are, generally speaking, most commonly published as images in figures. And people are good at looking at images, right? So people are actually a very effective way of turning those lines and boxes in the images into lines and boxes that are computationally accessible in Wiki Pathways models. And they think Science Game Lab is one of the avenues that they can really tap into to dramatically expand the size of their audience. So hopefully we will continue to work as partners with them as they attempt to achieve that. And so I'm going to stop now, but before I do, I will say a warm thank you to all the people that have put this together, especially the team from PlayMaddox, who have been working very hard to make it happen. In particular, Sarah has been responsible for effectively all of the web content that you see in the site, as well, including both the logic of the code, as well as all of the images that you see, all of the things that make it look beautiful. John is the principal engineer on the product, so managing how things work at a conceptual technical level and also implementing all of the server code. Patrick keeps this project running for us, has been a really useful point of contact with PlayMaddox and the team. Melanie Stegman has been in conversations with me about this project for literally years now, is a powerful member of the scientific gaming community, particularly for education, and has now been joined PlayMaddox to help with their work of making the Wiki Pathways experience effective. She's been a really great addition to our group, and I'm happy to have her. Margaret Wallace is the CEO of PlayMaddox and has been just a great supporter and cheerleader and thought leader throughout the whole duration of this project. And Nick is the guy I met 2 years ago now at the NIH meeting that made this group come together. And so thanks to them for getting this work done. Thanks to the group at Wiki Pathways for seeing the vision and helping us try and work to achieve it. I hope it works out for them. Thanks also to Ginger from our group, who has been beginning to lead the charge of reaching out to other game developers, and to Andrew, of course, who is involved in everything that we do. And with that, I will hopefully take any questions you might have in the time we have left. Thank you.
Yeah, so there's a question in the chat box from Margaret Wallace. It says, how do you sign up and be partners with SGL?
So Margaret is providing you guys with the question you should ask. She obviously knows that. So to sign up and be partners with Science Game Lab, go to sciencegamelab.org and sign up for an account, and then request access as a developer. And following the instructions, basically go to sciencegamelab.org, sign up, and then request access as a developer and get in communication with us directly, and we will get you set up. Margaret, you want to go into any more detail about that? You can chime in if you want.
Oh, it's all good. Thank you.
Okay.
I have a quick question. Do you track any statistics, like how many times someone's played the game, or like how many people have played that game?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So that's how we would produce these. The high scores and the badges and everything. So what we track right now is under the control of the game developer. And so we're not tracking anything, apart from basic traffic, apart from what they want us to track. So when you put in a game, and every time you have to basically send a message to the Science Game Lab server with information, and that all of that is kept. So that information is about, which tasks were generally speaking, which tasks were performed by whom, when, and then we can use that to feed into the high score list and the activity feeds and the achievements and so forth that you can see within the site.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. And currently
Ben,
oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Vincent.
And I guess if I wanted to create a game, it would be like a web site game, a game on a website, and it would connect directly to Science Game Lab using the
So currently, that's how it's set up. All the documentation is basically devoted to games that are done as websites. The server itself could handle a mobile game, for example. So it's just a web API that you implement. What we would not be able to provide you with in a kind of mobile or other kind of game is that wrapper, iframe display that you see around it. But you could still be a participant in the site even without that. And that's definitely a direction that we would like to take it, assuming we have enough money and participation, is to take it really more deeply into the mobile world.
Okay, that makes sense.
So this is Andrew here. I have a question. So Ben, you obviously alluded to the high cost and sort of expertise involved in getting high quality games built up, and of course we have this great partnership with PlayMaddox, in part because we have this little bit of money through BD2K, in part because PlayMaddox really buys into the concept and has some interest in leading the field here. But I guess absent those motivations, right? If we just, what would it take, or is it feasible to think about, the game development industry as a whole buying into scientific games? And what, in your mind, what might that model be?
The game development industry as a whole. That's an interesting question. I mean, I think that the closest model to that I've seen, like, big time, is the work of I forget his last name, Attila, right? Where they successfully put in basically collaborated with the makers of the game EVE Online, which has millions of players, to embed a protein-related image classification task within it, where you're not in a, kind of what we're seeing right here is, right, games, kind of made by scientists, generally for scientists or some, scientific enthusiast, where in that case it's games made for games, purpose, where science is sort of stuck in on the side. And so, and that was an extremely successful product from a crowdsourcing perspective. So that's one angle, which I think is very promising from the perspective of human computation and getting work cycles accomplished. The other angle, the video game industry is certainly going, guns blazing into building educational experiences. That's an enormous market for them. They're trying to figure it out. So there's two things that are already happening. I think, are you asking what else might happen?
No, I'm exactly asking those are answers to the question I'm asking. I guess, what are the business models, or more broadly, what are the incentives that would get people with card-carrying game development expertise to participate? And so I guess my follow-up would be the EVE Online is an interesting one, because, right, the question I would have that I don't remember if I've heard the answer to, is it did they do it out of altruism, or do they think that actually embedding the scientific game is beneficial to their game environment?
My impression for that particular one was that it's pretty much altruistic. They think it was a good thing to participate in, that they could help with support with fairly minimal effort on their part. But I don't know, this is something that, again, Margaret might want to chime in on. I mean, I could say that from working with them, the game industry doesn't necessarily provide everyone in it with a great opportunity to do something useful for humanity. And I think that element to this has been very inspirational and has led to a lot of extra work on their part. Even whether or not it leads to more money, they want to do it. Now, but ultimately, right, you have to get back to money, right? So I suspect that if you ultimately traffic, in the world can lead to money. And so if you could imagine ScienceGameLab.org was a for-profit or some sort of money-making activity, and people viewed it as that, people, in the same way that, let's say one of the models we looked at for building it was Congregate.com, which is a similar kind of unified portal experience just for video games. And that is a for-profit thing that makes lots of money. If the game industry here can tap into the feelings of need to contribute that I think we see, they can also make money through building these things. Yeah. I don't know, Margaret, do you want to chime in on that?
Yeah. So in terms of business models and monetization, what was so fortuitous about Ben coming to me is that I've had a lot of experience building out channels for digital media and games, and so in terms of monetization, we have a lot of potential on the table, and it's really just a matter of choosing our focus in terms of the top opportunity. And I could get into that more specifically, but we do have a range of ideas around the monetization that is based in best practices for other types of game portals, so it's not something we're just making up. But of course, we have the extra ethical considerations that this is meant to be for the purpose of discovery and exploration. So we're looking at business models that take that into account. And then as far as the game industry goes in general, we're in a very interesting time in the game industry. It's an industry hugely in flux. And, and that there are a lot of reasons for that. A lot of attention is being paid to overseas markets, specifically China. So for PlayMaddox, we saw Science Game Lab as an opportunity to continue to expand what we do, which is largely design thinking that has been applied to games, but to expand that to other industry sectors. And so I think that will be attractive to a lot of folks in the game development community. And EVE Online, they've always been an innovation leader. I know Hilmar, their CEO, fairly well. And I think that there will be more like him to follow, because that has been a fairly successful endeavor, if not on the monetization front, then certainly on the engagement front, from what I've heard from the creators of that experience.
Great, super interesting. Thanks to you both.
Okay, are there any other questions? All right, if not, thank you, Ben. Great presentation. And thank you for all the questions. That concludes today's conference. Thank you, everyone, for attending.